It happened in a single roar. No warning, no negotiation, no second chances. A US battleship forged from 45,000 tons of American steel unleashed a weapon so powerful that the ocean itself seemed to recoil. One trigger pull, one 16-inch naval gun, one projectile the size of a small car, and a Japanese heavy cruiser, confident in its armor and lineage, was ripped apart like a paper toy. Men who had survived typhoons, torpedoes, and air raids suddenly faced something they had never imagined. A shell traveling over 2,500 feet per second, weighing nearly 2,700 pounds, detonating with the force of a small earthquake. The first salvo didn't damage the cruiser. It tore it in half, bow and stern separating like two dying beasts drifting into oblivion. In that moment, the Japanese Navy realized something terrifying. They weren't fighting a ship. They were facing a nightmare armed with artillery. Before we dive deeper into the brutal science behind that first shot, I need something from you. Where are you watching this from right now? Are you sitting on a couch somewhere in Texas? Maybe you're in California sipping coffee while imagining those massive 16-inch shells racing across the Pacific. Or perhaps you're in a place I never expected. A city I'll only discover when you tell me in the comments. Drop your location down there, because I want to know where the people who love this kind of unapologetic military history are tuning in from. And while you're at it, if this story about American naval firepower is already blowing your mind, smash that like button. Let the algorithm know that this is the type of content you want more of. Stories of steel, fire, and moments where history was decided with a single pull of the trigger. Ready? Because what comes next is on an entirely different level. The Pacific was a graveyard of shattered steel long before the Iowa arrived, but nothing prowling those waters looked or behaved like this battleship. It wasn't just another capital ship. It was the apex predator of naval warfare, a floating fortress capable of outrunning cruisers, overpowering enemy battleships, and delivering artillery blows that rivaled land-based siege cannons. At over 860 feet long, nearly the length of 3 football fields end to end, the Iowa wasn't built to participate in a war. It was built to end one. Powered by 8 massive boilers, feeding 4 General Electric steam turbines, she pushed over 212,000 horsepower to her screws, driving the hull past 33 knots. No other battleship of its size could move like that. The Japanese didn't just underestimate her, they fundamentally misunderstood what she represented. They still believed speed, armor, and firepower were separate concepts. The Iowa proved they could coexist in one terrifying package, but all of that was just engineering, numbers on paper until the guns spoke. The battery that defined the Iowa wasn't merely large, it was biblical. 9 Mark 7 16-inch guns, each one weighing over 267,000 pounds and capable of hurling projectiles the size of Volkswagens over 20 miles. These weren't shells. They were declarations of annihilation. Armor-piercing rounds tipping the scale at 2,700 pounds didn't just penetrate steel, they erased it. They didn't just break hulls, they dissolved them into fragments and flame. The shockwave of the blast alone could knock a man off his feet hundreds of feet away. Every shot was a message, and that message echoed across the Pacific. This is what happens when American industry decides to solve a problem. The Japanese cruiser targeted that day wasn't insignificant. She was modern, proud, armored, and believed to be at a safe distance. Her crew had trained for air attacks, torpedo strikes, even long-range engagements with other cruisers. But no amount of discipline prepares a sailor for a weapon that can reach beyond the horizon and still land with pinpoint lethality. Naval warfare had always been dangerous. This was something else. This was asymmetry so violent it bordered on science fiction. As the Iowa closed the distance, the sea didn't feel calm anymore. The deck trembled with the rhythm of machinery pushing the battleship harder, faster, hunting. Radar systems, a domain where American ships were years ahead, plotted the target's movements with eerie precision. Japanese sailors still relied on optics, rangefinders, and mathematics rooted in the pre-radar age. Iowa's gunners used electronics capable of tracking a maneuvering target in the dark, through smoke, through chaos. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a demonstration of what happens when one side is already living in the future. The moment the order to fire was given, Time fell away. The turret's doors slammed shut, the breeches locked. The powder bags, massive silk-wrapped cylinders of explosive force, were rammed in behind the shell. The gun elevated, adjusting by fractions of a degree. Every man involved knew what was coming, yet none ever claimed to be fully prepared for it. The ignition signal flashed. Flames spat outward with apocalyptic fury. The recoil shoved the turret backward with enough force to move a railroad car. The concussion rolled across the ocean like thunder being torn open, and somewhere far beyond the gun's smoke, a cruiser began to die without yet understanding it. The shell didn't travel, it hunted. It punched through the distance as though the air wasn't even there. Sailors aboard the Japanese ship had seconds, just seconds, to comprehend the sound screaming toward them. Some imagined aircraft overhead. Others believed a torpedo detonation had misfired. No one expected a projectile with enough kinetic energy to vaporize bulkheads and rupture a ship's spine. But belief doesn't stop physics. Armor meant to defeat 8-inch shells was meaningless against something this massive. Impact wasn't a collision. It was an execution. The cruiser didn't explode immediately. She cracked. Metal groaned like an injured animal. Rivets tore loose. The bow lifted unnaturally. Bulkheads screamed. Men fell to their knees before they realized what was happening. The sea rushed into wounds the ship wasn't designed to survive. In less than a minute, she was no longer a vessel, but two halves drifting apart, each carrying sailors who understood, too late, that they had just witnessed a weapon that changed naval warfare forever. When the cruiser split, it wasn't a cinematic explosion with fireballs and debris arcing into the sky. It was worse. It was surgical. It was the kind of destruction that left no doubt. The enemy hadn't merely been defeated. They had been outclassed by a force of nature disguised as a battleship. The Japanese sailors who survived the initial shock weren't shouting orders or returning fire. They were frozen, staring at something their doctrine said was impossible. Ships didn't break like that. Armor didn't fail like that. Navies didn't die in one shot. And yet there it was, undeniable, horrifying proof drifting in the waves. The Iowa had done with a single shell what entire squadrons of bombers struggled to accomplish. Word spread faster than the smoke cleared. Radio operators across the Japanese task force hesitated before transmitting what they had just seen. There was no codebook entry for "our cruiser was cut in half by one shell." Commanders demanded confirmation. Spotters insisted it must have been multiple hits. Engineers suggested a secondary explosion. Pride refused to accept reality. But radar logs, range reports, and eyewitness accounts all pointed to the same truth. An American gun, a single gun, had redefined the boundaries of naval dominance. Meanwhile, aboard the Iowa, there was no celebration, no cheers, just professionalism carved from discipline. The crew moved with mechanical precision, already lining up the next salvo. They weren't shocked by the destruction because they understood what those guns could do. They had trained for moments like this. They knew that 16 inches of American steel didn't just travel, it rewrote equations. Every crew member was a cog in a machine so advanced that even admirals struggled to grasp the full scope of its power. Inside the plotting room, sailors observed firing solutions that seemed almost unreal. Analog computers, primitive by modern standards but revolutionary at the time, churned through variables: wind, roll, pitch, target velocity, barrel wear, shell type, range. Electrical signals calculated a firing arc that would have taken a pre-war gunnery officer half an hour by hand. With the Iowa, those calculations were returned in seconds. This wasn't just brute strength, it was mathematics weaponized. Far across the Pacific in Tokyo, analysts would later piece together what had happened. They tried to understand how a vessel the Japanese Navy once believed to be just another battleship could deliver firepower equal to an entire artillery regiment. Reports noted her propulsion, her armor belt, her secondary batteries. But everything in those dossiers paled next to the Mark 7 guns. These weren't cannons. They were industrial-scale punishment dispensers, capable of altering the course of engagements before the enemy even saw the ship that fired them. Back at the battle site, while the cruiser's stern sank at an unnatural angle, enemy destroyers scrambled to reposition. Their commanders calculated torpedo spreads, hoping to catch the Iowa at unsuspected angles. But hope wasn't enough. Iowa's radar operators tracked them long before they came into range. The destroyers thought they were predators. They were prey. A 2,700-pound armor-piercing round could pass through one destroyer, detonate inside another, and still have enough momentum to cripple a third. These ships weren't targets. They were obstacles in the shell's way. Even aircraft circling overhead hesitated. Pilots accustomed to dive-bombing slow, lumbering American ships now confronted something that could accelerate faster than some cruisers and hurl ordnance that tore hulls apart like wet paper. The Iowa wasn't just difficult to sink, she was hard to approach. Anti-aircraft batteries bristled along her decks, a forest of 5-inch dual-purpose guns ready to burn holes through any plane foolish enough to close distance. There is a moment in every war when the losing side realizes the fight is no longer fair. Strategists call it technological overmatch. Sailors call it terror. The Japanese Navy felt that moment the instant the cruiser folded like a broken spine. They had prepared for battles. They had not prepared for inevitability. The sea swallowed steel as though it were nothing. The waves closed around the dying cruiser, muffling the screams, drowning the engines, erasing everything except the truth. The age of traditional naval engagement had ended. From that point forward, whoever controlled weapons like those mounted on the Iowa would control the very shape of the world. And the world was just beginning to understand what America had unleashed. Long after the last fragment of the cruiser disappeared beneath the surface, the psychological damage lingered like poison in the Japanese fleet. Ships are made of steel, but navies are made of men. And men talk. Sailors whispered that the Americans possessed guns capable of splitting battleships in half with a single hit. Some claimed the shells were guided. Others insisted the Iowa was armored with some unknown alloy. Rumors metastasized faster than facts. When technology outruns comprehension, myth fills the void. And that is exactly what the Iowa created that day. A legend forged not from propaganda, but from physics too violent to ignore. Commanders reviewed the engagement and discovered something even more disturbing. The Iowa hadn't been operating at maximum effectiveness. Her fire control radar had not yet fully synchronized with the swell of the sea. Her gunners had not fired a full salvo, and only one turret had engaged its target. In other words, the shot that ripped the cruiser in half wasn't the Iowa at her peak. It was the Iowa on a warm-up lap. What would have happened if all 9 guns fired simultaneously? If the shells had landed tight, coordinated, and timed to break a hull at its stress points? Naval engineers quietly answered that question. Entire task forces could be neutralized in minutes. Meanwhile, American strategists studied the data from the encounter with clinical detachment. They saw the enemy panic. They heard the intercepted transmissions. They noted the hesitation in Japanese captains' voices. Victory isn't just measured in ships sunk. It's measured in decisions altered. After that day, Japanese cruisers no longer moved with confidence. Destroyers maintained wider spacing. Battleships maneuvered with caution. Entire formations shifted tactically, not because of what they understood, but because of what they feared. The Iowa didn't just destroy a ship, it rewired the Japanese psyche. And yet here was the irony. The Iowa didn't exist to chase cruisers. She had been conceived for a far deadlier mission, to counter the Yamato-class battleships, colossal beasts that Japan believed represented the unbeatable apex of naval architecture. The Yamato carried 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship. Japanese planners expected those guns to dominate any capital ship foolish enough to challenge them. What they never anticipated was an American ship that didn't need bigger guns, only smarter ones. Where the Yamato relied on mass, the Iowa relied on velocity. Where the Yamato trusted armor, the Iowa trusted computation. Where the Yamato believed in tradition, the Iowa embodied innovation. And when a 2,700-pound shell slams into a hull at over 2,500 feet per second, the difference isn't academic, it's lethal. Armor plate becomes irrelevant. Welding seams become suggestions. Defensive doctrine evaporates. Further complicating Japan's nightmare was range. Iowa could strike enemies over 20 miles away. At that distance, the curvature of the Earth hid her hull, meaning she could kill ships that couldn't even see her. The ocean had always been risky. Now it was blind. On Japanese ships, damage control officers began asking unspeakable questions. What do we do when armor doesn't matter? How do we evade a projectile that travels faster than our fastest scouts? How can we counter a ship that weaponizes mathematics, radar, and industrial might in equal measure? There was no satisfactory answer. Every navy has a breaking moment. For some, it's the loss of a carrier. For others, it's the collapse of a doctrine. For Japan, it was realizing that their proudest cruisers and destroyers existed not in competition with the Iowa, but at her mercy. The Pacific War no longer felt like a contest. It felt like a countdown. On the Iowa, the guns cooled, but no one relaxed. Officers understood that this battle was merely a demonstration, a message carved into steel and sea foam. America wasn't flexing. America was warning, and Japan, for the first time, truly listened. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the engagement had mutated from a naval battle into something closer to an autopsy of Japan's naval doctrine. The Iowa didn't chase. She didn't rush. Predators don't sprint after prey. They let the fear do most of the killing. Enemy destroyers scattered, each captain convinced that distance equaled safety. It didn't. Iowa's radar tracked them with clinical detachment, plotting trajectories, speeds, and angles, like a judge reading out sentences. Her gunnery crews didn't see ships. They saw solutions. The next shot was not fired to sink. It was fired to educate. A destroyer, banking starboard at full throttle, believed it was outside effective range. It wasn't. A single 2,700-pound round arced through the sky, disappearing into the clouds. Sailors aboard the Japanese vessels scanned the horizon for planes, convinced an air attack was inbound. Then the world cracked open. The shell slammed into the sea beside the destroyer, detonating underwater, ripping a cavern of displaced water so violent that the ship lifted as if yanked upward by a leviathan. Bulkheads buckled, machinery tore loose. The destroyer wasn't sunk. It was crippled, left floating in confusion, its hull trembling like a wounded animal waiting for the final blow. That blow never came. Iowa didn't waste ammunition on what was already dead. She was hunting the rest. American fire control didn't rely on luck or intuition. It relied on the Mark 8 radar, a marvel of wartime engineering capable of calculating range with yard-level accuracy in storms, darkness, and chaos. Japanese rangefinders required visibility, calm water, trained spotters. Iowa required electricity and patience. One system belonged to the past. The other belonged to whatever came next in warfare. Every enemy vessel that turned away from Iowa revealed something deeper than fear. They revealed doctrine failure. Japan had believed for decades that warships were duels, ship against ship, captain against captain, steel against steel. Iowa shattered that illusion in minutes. This wasn't a duel. This was execution by mathematics. Aircraft attempted a desperate counterstrike. Dive bombers approached from high altitude, convinced they could slip past the battleship's gunners. But Iowa wasn't just a fortress of steel, she was a hedgehog of anti-aircraft death. 40mm Bofors cannons hammered the sky with streams of explosive shells. 20mm Oerlikons sliced through wings and fuselages with torrents of tracer fire. 5-inch dual-purpose guns stitched detonations so dense that pilots described the air as solid metal. Planes didn't burn. They evaporated. Wreckage splashed into the ocean like discarded toys. Pilots returned to base shaken, describing the Iowa as something beyond classification. One report stated, "It fires like a battleship, moves like a cruiser, and hunts like something not built by men." The statement was exaggerated, but only slightly. What Japanese officers feared most wasn't the guns, or the armor, or the speed. It was the realization that Iowa had turned the ocean into a battlefield, where distance meant nothing, armor meant nothing, tradition meant nothing. They were fighting an opponent who valued innovation over grandeur, efficiency over myth, and precision over ceremony. Japan's naval culture worshipped the idea of the decisive battle, a single heroic clash where honor and steel determined destiny. Iowa's guns had delivered something far colder, inevitability. As darkness settled, the sea glowed faintly from burning oil. Two halves of a cruiser drifted apart in silent testimony. A crippled destroyer limped in circles, unable to steer. Floating debris marked the grave of doctrines that once seemed eternal. And still, Iowa prowled. She wasn't searching for battle. Battle was searching for her. Some events in war ripple outward. Others rupture reality so violently that nations, admirals, and entire doctrines must rebuild themselves around the crater left behind. The Iowa's first kill wasn't a tactical victory. It was a strategic detonation. Japan didn't lose a cruiser that day. Japan lost the illusion of parity. Intelligence officers aboard surviving vessels scrambled to relay what happened, distorting the story with every transmission. A single shell destroyed a cruiser in one blow. The Americans have a new gun. They can see through smoke. They can fire faster than we can think. Some messages were dismissed as panic. Others were locked away as classified nightmares, but none of them were ignored. Because no matter how the story mutated, one truth remained intact. Something new had entered the war. In Tokyo, naval architects pored over schematics of the Yamato-class battleships, searching for comfort in steel. The Yamato's armor belt was over 16 inches thick, layered, angled, engineered to withstand impacts from any naval gun in existence. But the Mark VII wasn't just a gun. It was a physics equation that refused to behave. Iowa's shells didn't need to smash through armor at a perpendicular angle. They could be fired in high arcs, plunging down from above, where armor was thinner and weld lines betrayed vulnerabilities. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the question seeped into every room. What if the Yamato isn't invincible? The enemy didn't yet know the worst of it. They saw the Mark VII's fury, but they didn't understand what lurked beneath it, the Mark XIII fire control system. This was not guesswork. This was predictive targeting, an analog brain capable of plotting where a ship would be, not where it was. The Japanese didn't know they were facing the closest thing to a naval oracle. A Japanese cruiser could zigzag, turn, accelerate, slow. Iowa's guns didn't care. They didn't chase movement, they anticipated it. Meanwhile, in Washington, analysts reviewed after-action reports with something bordering on disbelief. The Iowa hadn't been tested against large capital ships yet, but it didn't need to be. Data spoke louder than torpedoes. A weapon that could erase a modern cruiser with a single strike didn't just threaten fleets, it destabilized strategy. Every nation that built ships suddenly had a problem. Naval power wasn't measured in hulls anymore. It was measured in how long you could survive once a Mark VII picked you as a target. American engineers had created a weapon so overwhelming that it forced the world to adapt or die. The Iowa-class battleships weren't the end of naval warfare. They were the inflection point. Everything after them, from missile cruisers to nuclear submarines, was a reaction to the question Iowa asked. What do you build when gunpowder reaches perfection? On the other side of the ocean, Japanese sailors tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. They touched twisted steel plates, traced the sheared edges of bulkheads, stared at a wound no naval textbook could explain. Some believed the Americans had invented a new kind of shell, one infused with explosives unknown to Japan. Others believed the guns were assisted by radar, so advanced it bordered on sorcery. But the truth, the unbearable truth, was simpler. America's industrial base had outgrown Japan's imagination. The Pacific had always been large. Now it felt claustrophobic, a vast arena where something unstoppable lurked beyond the horizon, unseen, unheard, but always capable of ending a ship's existence in seconds. What haunted Japanese commanders most wasn't the noise of the guns, it was the silence after. The realization that a ship could simply cease to be. A single shot, a single moment, a single correction in firing angles. Death didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with certainty. Night fell like a shroud, and with it came the part of warfare that cannot be measured by tonnage, caliber, or range, the aftermath inside the human mind. Ships burn, steel sinks. But fear floats. It lingers on the surface long after the wreckage is gone. The Iowa didn't just shatter a cruiser, it severed Japan's confidence. Every vessel that now sailed under the rising sun carried an invisible passenger. The expectation that doom could arrive from beyond sight, beyond sound, beyond comprehension. Japanese officers gathered in dimly lit flag compartments, studying maps as though cartography could save them. They traced arcs of engagement, recalculated firing ranges, and redrafted fleet formations. Their pencils moved, but their eyes betrayed something deeper: resignation. Strategy only exists when options do. After the Iowa fired her first shot, options evaporated. There was no shield against a weapon that turned distance into irrelevance. No maneuver could outpace a shell moving faster than thought. Worse still, the Iowa wasn't alone. She had sisters: New Jersey, Missouri, Wisconsin. Battleships carved from the same industrial gospel, each capable of rewriting the laws of naval combat. Japan wasn't facing a monster. It was facing a species. Even among American crews, there was an unspoken gravity to what had happened. They had witnessed power at a scale few humans ever confront, not abstract, not theoretical, but tangible. When a cruiser breaks in half, men don't just disappear. Memories do. Families lose futures. Entire histories sink. American sailors respected that weight. They didn't cheer, they prepared. Somewhere in the black void of the Pacific, spotters searched for Iowa's silhouette, a shape they now associated with inevitability. The ship didn't roar. She whispered. Her engines hummed at low RPMs, a predator conserving strength. Her wake glowed faintly, as phosphorescent organisms churned in her path, leaving a ghostly line of light behind her, a celestial marker of where death had passed moments before. There is an ancient truth in naval warfare. The ocean loves nothing. It buries the arrogant and the innocent with equal indifference. But for the first time, sailors realized something more terrifying than the sea existed. A machine crafted with purpose so singular it nearly felt mythological. Iowa wasn't a vessel. She was a verdict. The Japanese Navy had always believed in decisive battle, a clash of titans that would determine the fate of empires. They imagined soaring flagships, thunderous broadsides, heroic captains shouting orders over walls of fire. Instead, they received mathematics, radar, and ordnance moving at transonic speeds. The war they trained for no longer existed. They had prepared for swords. They faced rifles. And yet, the Iowa was just beginning. Her magazines still held dozens of shells capable of collapsing steel hulls like cheap tin. Her radar array continued sweeping the horizon with mechanical patience. Her bridge officers observed the enemy scatter in the dark. They didn't wonder if another target would appear. They wondered when. Because that was the lesson of the day. Naval warfare had shifted from contest to calculation. Battles weren't decided by valor. They were decided by velocity. He who struck first, with precision and reach, owned the future. The Iowa had fired once, and the world learned it was enough. What followed wasn't silence. It was anticipation. The knowledge that somewhere, hidden behind a curvature of water and fate, lurked a ship capable of reshaping reality with a single command. A gun crew waiting, a target unaware, a trigger untouched, but ready. Always ready. When dawn finally broke over the Pacific, smoke still clung to the horizon like a stubborn memory, refusing to leave the stage where history had just been rewritten. The Iowa rested in the calm waters, her hull unscarred, her crew composed, her guns silent but far from finished. She hadn't merely won a battle. She had defined a new standard of naval warfare. A single shot had severed steel, doctrine, and centuries of belief about what a battleship could do. That moment didn't belong to fate. It belonged to the men who dared to build, crew, and command a machine capable of such terrifying precision. Engineers who calculated stresses no human eyes could see, gunners who treated each shell like destiny, radar operators who reached into the dark to drag targets into the light. They were not just doing jobs. They were shaping the ocean itself, and the sailors who stood behind those guns understood something few ever will. Victory isn't born from noise, explosions, or spectacle. It's born from preparation, innovation, and the unbreakable resolve to protect freedom at any cost. To them, to every hand that welded, loaded, aimed, plotted, and fought, history owes a debt. Because on that day, in that hell, America didn't just fire a shot. It fired a warning the world would never forget.